I am Mary Sketch with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition, and I am for the soil to protect the landscapes, waterways, and resources that provide the food that we all eat and the lands that we recreate on for current and future generations.
Welcome everyone to part 2 of our special episode with Madelyn Smith with the Common Grain Alliance. I'm Jeff Ishii, your host, and my co-host Dr. Eric Benfelt with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition are joining me. Mary, would you reintroduce our returning guest today?
Yes, great to have Madelyn Smith, the Executive Director of the Common Grain Alliance, back for another episode. We spoke last time about education and the small grains economy, so excited to continue that conversation. To kick things off, Madelyn, would be interested, we talked a lot about the education, the role of consumers. Would be interested in what role does educating policymakers for the Common Grain Alliance play in that, and what does that, if anything, look like for you all?
State and federal policy is incredibly important to setting the boundary conditions that we're all working in, as folks who are trying to kind of build a regional system. And there's been such a huge focus from the kind of current administration on both the federal and the state level in Virginia on supporting regional food systems development, which has been great to see. There have been many grant programs that have been coming out to support and invest in regional food systems infrastructure that we're really excited to see those support systems kind of coming through. And it's an example about how important it is to have policymakers understand kind of what we're trying to do here and how regional food systems can be a real driver for soil health. Within Common Grain Alliance, we really acknowledge that and try to be in the room whenever it's possible to speak directly to policymakers about some of the things that they can do to support the work that we have ongoing. So there was a small farm town hall at the VABF conference in Roanoke in January that we participated in. And we're always looking for those other venues that we can show up to. As a somewhat capacity constrained organization, it's something that we certainly want to do more in the future, facilitating those conversations with our members about how policy can support their work and translating that to policymakers on both the state and federal level. But because we're small now, we're kind of looking for those other avenues that are in discussion spaces that are being created by other organizations like the Virginia Biological Farming Association at their conference, where we can make our voice heard.
We're talking today with Madelyn Smith with the Common Grain Alliance. And Madelyn, I'd love to hear your commentary about consumer demand when it comes to local grains. Your colleague, Dr. Heather Corner, touched on this when we spoke with her several months ago. She was a guest of this very podcast, and she talked about consumer demand for local grains, how they're not being met. For instance, you can go to any farmer's market in Maryland or Virginia or Pennsylvania or in the District of Columbia. You can find locally grown tomatoes and herbs and squash and melons and fresh cut flowers, but you can't seem to find locally grown wheat or barley or rye, things of that nature. And specifically, I love to feed the birds, and I have actually been looking for locally grown, locally sourced bird foods, but I can't seem to find it. I'm talking about black oil sunflower and millet seed and all the various seeds that go into a high quality wild bird food, but I can't seem to find that. And that seems to me as an unmet consumer demand. What are your thoughts in this arena?
Yes, I would definitely agree with Heather's comment that the consumer demand is there. And what's challenging now is building the supply of regional grain and the infrastructure piece. One way that we've really tried to investigate what that demand is and what Common Grain Alliance can do to help connect consumers with small grain farmers in the Mid-Atlantic is through our grain stand program. So we have a partnership with Fresh Farm in Washington, D.C. Fresh Farm is the organization that runs most of D.C.'s farmers markets, where we are putting on a grain stand and grain share program. So we are purchasing grain products from a variety of Common Grain Alliance member farmers and mills. We're aggregating them in a shared warehouse space that's managed by Fresh Farm, and we are bringing them to farmers markets in the DC area. And that program has helped us make small grains more available at those farmers markets for exactly the reason that you voiced, which is just you can't find them at most farmers markets now. And test consumer demand and really educate the public that you can buy a bag of oatmeal that's produced in the Mid-Atlantic region, and it's something that exists and something that folks should be looking for and asking for. And we've seen a lot of success with that program and really looking for ways to continue it. But I think some of the challenge there is just it's really expensive to show up for a small grain farmer to show up at a farmer's market every single week. There's a lot of hidden costs there with labor, with distribution, again, like transporting products to market and really making those stands profitable. So that's why we're exploring that collaborative model where we can represent multiple farms under one farm stand and really increase the availability of those products and create more direct-to-consumer market channels for Common Grain Alliance member farmers. So that's one thing that we're doing to really try to tap into that latent demand. And we're also exploring other ways that Common Grain Alliance can collaboratively address some of the supply chain challenges with distribution, storage, to try to take some of that friction out of the system and make it more possible to have small grain products at local retailers across the region.
And Madelyn, my question maybe builds on that, and it's the aspirations for the Common Grain Alliance. I know on the website you emphasize the importance of conservation practices for long-term resilience and soil health for taste and flavor, but then also, some larger societal values as far as vibrant communities, healthy environment, and a prosperous economy. If you could speak to not only the present aspirations, but the future aspirations of Common Grain Alliance.
Our vision is really to create a regional food system for local grain that that from a consumer angle, allows consumers to go to a local retailer, to go to a farmer's market, to be able to purchase a bag of locally produced rice, oatmeal, beans, other staple food crops, and to know where those crops have come from, and to know that the farmer that's producing them is producing them in an environmentally sustainable way. So we really believe that those staple food crops, legumes, as well as small grain crops like millet, rye, oats, these are crops that are integral components of good crop rotations. So even beyond just small grains, we also want to think about those legumes that bring nitrogen back into the soil. That diversity of crops, we want to be creating markets for each piece of the crop rotation that is necessary for a healthy farm ecosystem.
In Madelyn, when it comes to selling local grains, we talked some about the storytelling piece is really important. And while demand is growing, is Common Grain Alliance working with producers, or are you seeing your producers telling that story, the ones who are selling either direct to consumer or through other models? I think of my parents who are recently part of a CSA, or community supported agriculture operation, and they sent me the other day a newsletter they got and said, "Have you heard of this no-till thing?" And they were so excited about learning that, and it definitely encouraged them them to think about their purchasing and whatnot. But, just I guess a long way to ask, how are you seeing producers telling the story of why how they produce their grains matters?
I think that some of the best storytellers for local grains are actually some of the chefs and bakers who are kind of that first point of contact with consumers. And so I think of some of the artisan bakers within the Common Grain Alliance network who people really fall in love with the food first, and then they want to know more about where that food comes from. Um, both food and beverage. So Nico Melas of Millsong Bakery, who sells at the Harrisonburg Farmers Market, John Derry of Meadow Bread, Jonathan Bethany of Selu, Evram and his sister at Sub Rosa Bakery in Richmond. These are businesses. Also, John Branding of Wheatland Spring Farm and Brewery, to give a beverage example. People are attracted to those businesses because their food and beer is incredible. So that's really the hook for getting people interested in knowing more, is that they'll eat the best loaf of bread they've ever had in their entire life and ask, why is this so much better than, bread that I'm getting from other places? And that is really the opening for the conversation about why regional grain is so important. It's fresher, it's freshly milled, so it's a more nutritious product. There is a relationship between the baker and the farmer, which allows them to talk about the grain that's being grown, the positive attributes, the negative attributes, and have kind of a positive feedback loop for improving that end product. And so that's something that's really unique that you don't get in a commodity grain value chain where it's an anonymous bag of flour without a farmer name attached to it, right? So I think that's how I've seen it play out in my work in Common Grain Alliance. Is you have to hook people with a really good end product, and then they naturally want to know more about why it tastes the way it tastes or what is so special about it. And that's where you can bring in the connection to the farmer, the connection to the way that they farm, and those human relationships along the value chain that allow you to value other things beyond yield and a low price.
We're talking today with Madelyn Smith with the Common Grain Alliance, and of course, there's so many resources available at your website, commongrainalliance.org. But just earlier this morning, I discovered your YouTube channel. I was unaware you had a YouTube channel for the Common Grain Alliance, and I'm just scrolling now through a list of it's a multitude of videos all about common grain production and marketing right here in our region. For instance, there's a video that's it's over an hour video on stone ground milling, growing grains for soil health, local beer starts with local grains, marketing your grains and grain products, backyard rice production. I had no idea that was a thing. Just so many resources available simply at your YouTube channel for Common Grain Alliance. That is a great resource. Tell me more.
I'm glad you brought this up too, because we're about to drop a lot more videos that will be incredible resources on our YouTube channel. We hosted our first Mid-Atlantic Grain Conference in October, with sessions on soil health led by some of the kind of leading regenerative grain farmers in our region, talking about their experiences and their wealth of knowledge about integrating small grain crops in their operations. We also had sessions focused on marketing, building business relationships along the value chain, and many other topics. We recorded all those sessions, and they will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks. So if you weren't able to be there in person, you can get the benefit of the knowledge that was shared at that conference virtually. So it's really a repository of information that we've been crowdsourcing through our 120 members who are really kind of experts in their field and living this day in and day out, trying to rebuild our regional grain economy.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up in this episode, but Madelyn, I want to thank you for everything that you do, you and your incredible team of volunteers there at Common Grain Alliance, with a focus on soil health and regenerative agriculture right here in our region. And for our listeners, once again, that web address is commongrainalliance.org. And yes, indeed, they have a vast YouTube channel with a lot of very interesting information. Thank you for joining us, Madelyn, and also Dr. Benfelt and Mary. We'll catch you in the next one. For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you should have a specific question about soil health, just call your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.